12 men. No priest, no scribe, no recognized religious leader. Jesus of Nazareth looked at fishermen with calloused hands, a tax collector hated by his own people, a zealot who carried hatred against Rome, and said, "You are going to change the world." 3 years later, 11 of them were hiding in fear of dying. 50 days later, they were facing empires. What happened between those two moments is one of the most poorly told stories in the Bible. First-century Galilee was not a place of prestige. The Jews of Judea looked at Galileans with contempt. The accent was coarse, the culture was mixed with pagan influences, and the region was more than 140 kilometers from Jerusalem, far enough to be considered second-class territory. When Nathanael first heard of Jesus, his reaction was automatic. Can anything good come from Nazareth? The question was not rhetorical. It was geographical prejudice. Nazareth was a village so insignificant that it does not appear in any Old Testament text, in any writing by Josephus, or in any rabbinic document of the time. An estimated population of 400 people living in houses carved into the limestone rock. It was there that Jesus grew up. And it was from places like that that he chose his representatives. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. We continue. Think of the setting. The Roman Empire dominated the entire Mediterranean world with a military machine of more than 300,000 soldiers. The Temple of Jerusalem was one of the most impressive structures of the ancient world, covered with so much gold that travelers reported being unable to look directly at it under the midday sun. The Pharisees controlled the interpretation of the law with obsessive rigor. 613 rules derived from the Torah that dictated every aspect of life. The Sadducees dominated religious politics and maintained delicate agreements with Rome. This was the system, consolidated, powerful, unshakable. And Jesus ignored all of it. Instead of recruiting from among those graduated from the rabbinic schools of Hillel or Shammai, he walked to the Sea of Galilee. The lake was approximately 21 kilometers long by 13 wide, and its waters sustained a fishing industry that fed the entire region. Wooden boats about 8 meters long sailed in groups during the night when the fish rose to the surface. The work was brutal. The fishermen cast nets that weighed dozens of kilos when wet, pulled them by arm strength, sorted the catch, repaired the equipment, and repeated everything the next night. Peter, Andrew, James, and John had known this cycle since childhood. Their hands had callus upon callus. Their bodies carried the smell of fish that no washing completely removed. They were practical men, accustomed to the failure of fishless nights and the joy of full nets. They had no theological training. They had no political connections. They had nothing that qualified them to lead a religious movement. Jesus called them anyway. The Gospel of Mark records the scene with an economy of words that hides the radical nature of the moment. "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Immediately. The Greek word is euthys, and Mark uses it 42 times in his Gospel to create a sense of constant urgency. But consider what this immediately meant in practice. Peter was married. We know this because Jesus healed his mother-in-law in Capernaum. James and John worked with their father Zebedee in a family business that included hired servants. They were not destitute. They had structure, responsibilities, commitments, and they dropped everything based on a sentence from a carpenter from Nazareth whom they barely knew. Later tradition tried to soften this madness. Some scholars suggest that the fishermen already knew Jesus from previous encounters, that the decision was less impulsive than it seems, perhaps. But even if there were prior familiarity, the fact remains, adult men with families and businesses abandoned their source of livelihood to follow an itinerant preacher with no salary, no headquarters, and no guarantee of anything. The risk was total. Matthew represents another type of scandal. The Gospels present him sitting at the tax office in Capernaum when Jesus passes by and says only, "Follow me." To understand the weight of this scene, you need to understand what it meant to be a publican in first-century Judea. Tax collectors worked for Rome. They bought the right to collect taxes in a certain region and kept everything they managed to extract beyond the official quota. The system was designed for corruption. Publicans were hated not only for collaborating with the foreign occupier, but for enriching themselves at the expense of their own people. They were forbidden from testifying in Jewish courts. They were excluded from synagogues. They were classified alongside prostitutes and notorious sinners. Jesus did not just call Matthew. He went to dinner at his house, surrounded by other tax collectors and people of questionable reputation. The Pharisees were scandalized. Jesus' response went down in history. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. The group that formed around Jesus was a sociological impossibility. Matthew, the collaborator with Rome, had to live daily with Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were radical nationalists who advocated armed resistance against the empire. Some historians associate them with the Sicarii, assassins who hid small daggers under their garments and attacked Roman soldiers or Jews considered traitors in the midst of crowds. Put these two men in the same group, following the same master, sleeping side by side on the same roads. The tension must have been unbearable, but something in Jesus' call transcended the political divisions that defined the era. Philip was from Bethsaida, the same city as Peter and Andrew. The Gospel of John shows him as someone with a practical mind, perhaps excessively focused on logistics. When Jesus asked where they would buy bread to feed the multitude, Philip made a quick calculation. 200 denarii would not be enough to give even a piece to each one. A denarius was a day's wage. Philip was saying that 8 months' salary would not solve the problem. He looked at the impossibility. Jesus looked at 5 loaves and 2 fish. The multiplication that followed fed more than 5,000 men, not counting women and children. 12 baskets were left over, one for each apostle to carry, as if Jesus wanted them to feel the weight of the miracle that their limited minds could not conceive. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, was the initial skeptic who became a convinced believer. Jesus saw him under the fig tree before being introduced to him, an apparently trivial detail that provoked in Nathanael an immediate confession. "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Something in that moment of supernatural recognition broke all his objections. The man who doubted that anything good could come from Nazareth became one of the 12 who would give their lives for the message of a Nazarene. Thomas went down in history as the one who doubted, but this reduction is deeply unfair. When Jesus decided to return to Judea to raise Lazarus, the disciples tried to dissuade him. The Jews had just tried to stone him. Returning was suicide. Thomas then said to the others, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This is not the speech of a coward or a superficial skeptic. It is radical loyalty. Thomas was willing to die alongside Jesus long before the cross. His later doubt, the demand to touch the wounds of the risen one, came from a man who loved deeply and who had seen his dreams nailed to a cross. Thomas's doubt was grief, not cynicism. James, son of Alphaeus, is one of the apostles about whom we know the least. Sometimes called James the Less to distinguish him from the son of Zebedee, he appears only in the apostolic lists and in practically no individual scene in the Gospels. The silence of the Scriptures about him is almost total. But this silence carries its own meaning. Jesus did not choose only striking personalities. He also chose the obscure, those who would work away from the spotlight, those who would serve without recognition. The history of the church was built as much by the names we remember as by those we forget. Jude, son of James, not Iscariot, is also called Thaddeus in some manuscripts. His only recorded speech in the Gospels is a question asked during the Last Supper. "Lord, why will you manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" The question reveals the messianic expectation of the time. The disciples still expected a visible revolution, a seizure of power that would show the world who Jesus really was. They did not understand that the kingdom would come in a completely different way. And there is Judas Iscariot. The man who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver remains a theological and psychological enigma. The Gospel of John presents him as a thief who diverted money from the group's common purse. But does greed explain the betrayal? 30 pieces of silver were equivalent to about 120 denarii, 4 months' salary for an ordinary worker. It was the price of a slave, as established in Exodus. A significant amount, but not a fortune. Some scholars speculate that Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand to precipitate the messianic confrontation he believed was inevitable. Others simply see the action of evil incarnate. Jesus himself said it would have been better for that man not to have been born. Judas hanged himself after seeing the result of his betrayal. The field bought with the returned money became known as the Field of Blood. The remaining 11 also failed at the critical hour. When the soldiers arrived at Gethsemane, they all fled. Peter followed from a distance to the courtyard of the high priest, where a servant girl recognized him. 3 times he denied knowing Jesus. The 3rd time, the rooster crowed, and Peter went out from there weeping bitterly. The man who had promised to die alongside the Master could not even admit he knew him before a servant girl. The cross should have ended everything. The Romans were specialists in public executions designed to humiliate and terrorize. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals, rebellious slaves, traitors, political agitators. The victim was exposed naked, nailed or tied to a wooden structure, and left to die slowly from asphyxiation, exhaustion, or shock. The process could last days. Jesus died in approximately 6 hours, a relatively short time that led Pilate to be surprised when Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body. The disciples hid. The dream was over. The Messiah was dead. 3 days later, everything changed. The account of the resurrection varies in details among the Gospels, but the core is consistent. The tomb was empty, and Jesus appeared alive to his followers, first to the women, then to Peter. Then to the 12 gathered, to Thomas who touched the wounds, to more than 500 people at once, as Paul records in 1 Corinthians. For 40 days Jesus appeared repeatedly, ate with them, taught about the kingdom, and prepared them for what was to come. Then he ascended. The apostles received a command: wait in Jerusalem until you are clothed with power. 120 people gathered in an upper room to pray. On the day of Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, the Holy Spirit descended like a rushing wind and tongues of fire. Galilean men without formal education began to speak in languages they had never learned. The crowd that gathered was astonished. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, regions of Libya around Cyrene, Romans, Cretans, and Arabs. Each one heard the message in their own language. Peter, the same Peter who had denied Jesus 3 times, stood up and preached. 3,000 people were converted that day. The transformation was evident. The men who had fled from Jesus' arrest now faced the same Sanhedrin that had condemned him. When ordered to stop preaching, they replied, "Judge for yourselves whether it is right to obey you rather than God." They were imprisoned. They were flogged. They left the presence of the court rejoicing for having been considered worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. James, son of Zebedee, was the first apostle to die as a martyr. Around the year 44, King Herod Agrippa ordered him to be killed by the sword. The Book of Acts records the execution in a single sentence without details, without dramatization. The brevity is shocking. One of the 3 disciples closest to Jesus, one of those who witnessed the transfiguration, killed like that, almost in passing in the biblical text. But his death set the standard. Following Jesus could cost everything. Peter continued leading the church in Jerusalem until persecution forced him to move. Tradition places him in Rome in the final years of his life. Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century church historian, records that Peter was crucified during Nero's persecution, around the year 64 or 67. Tradition adds that Peter asked to be crucified upside down, not considering himself worthy to die in the same way as his Lord. St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican was built over the site where tradition says he was buried. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century found a Roman necropolis under the basilica and bones that some believe to be those of the apostle. Andrew, Peter's brother, took the gospel to the north. Tradition associates him with Scythia, a region corresponding approximately to present-day Ukraine and to Greece. He died in Patras on an X-shaped cross, the cross that still bears his name today and appears on the flag of Scotland. According to ancient accounts, Andrew preached for 2 days while hanging, refusing to be taken down until he finally died. The Orthodox Church considers him its spiritual founder, and his alleged relics are scattered across churches in Amalfi, Italy, in Patras and other locations. John, the son of Zebedee, is traditionally considered the author of the 4th Gospel, 3 letters, and Revelation. Unlike the others, he did not die as a martyr. Tertullian records that he was thrown into boiling oil in Rome, but miraculously survived and was exiled to the island of Patmos. There, according to tradition, he received the visions of Revelation. After being released, he settled in Ephesus, where he led the churches of Asia Minor until he died of old age, possibly over 90 years old. He was the last survivor of the 12. Philip, according to tradition preserved by Eusebius, preached in Phrygia, a region of present-day Turkey. He died in Hierapolis, possibly crucified or hung upside down. Recent archaeological excavations found a 1st-century tomb in Hierapolis that some archaeologists associate with the apostle. Bartholomew, the skeptical Nathaniel who became a believer, has one of the most brutal martyrdom traditions. According to accounts, he took the gospel to India and then to Armenia. In Albanopolis, he was flayed alive before being beheaded. The image of Bartholomew holding his own skin became a common motif in medieval art. Michelangelo painted him this way in the Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel, and they say the face on the skin is a self-portrait of the artist himself. Matthew, the former tax collector, wrote the gospel that bears his name, at least according to the tradition of the early church. His gospel was the most cited in the first centuries of Christianity, probably because it was written with Jews in mind, with constant references to Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in Jesus. Regarding his death, traditions vary. Some place him in Ethiopia, others in Persia. Some say he died in peace, others that he was martyred. What is certain is that he went from a tax table in Capernaum to the ends of the known world. Thomas is one of the most extraordinary stories. Syriac tradition sends him east, far beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. He is said to have reached India around the year 52, establishing Christian communities on the Malabar coast in the southwest of the subcontinent. The St. Thomas Christians exist to this day, a community that traces its origin directly to the Apostle, more than 1900 years before any European missionary reached the region. Thomas is said to have been martyred near Chennai, in southeast India, pierced by spears while praying. St. Thomas Cathedral, built over his alleged tomb, is one of the oldest pilgrimage sites in Christendom. Simon the Zealot preached possibly in Persia, together with Jude Thaddeus. According to tradition, the two were martyred together in Persia, Simon sawn in half, Jude killed by axe blows. Other traditions place Simon in Britain or North Africa. What remains is the contrast. A man who had dedicated his life to violence against Rome died as a peaceful martyr for a faith that transcended nationalisms. James, son of Alphaeus, the silent apostle of the Gospels, remains obscure in later tradition as well. Some sources identify him with James the Less, mentioned in Mark. Others distinguish him completely. His martyrdom is said to have occurred in Egypt or Persia, but the details are inconsistent. He represents all the anonymous Christians who served faithfully without leaving great marks on historical records. Jude Thaddeus is venerated to this day as the saint of impossible causes. Popular devotion transformed the obscure apostle into an intercessor for desperate situations. According to tradition, he preached in Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia, and Persia. His death alongside Simon in Persia is celebrated by the Catholic Church on October 28th. Judas Iscariot's place was filled by Matthias, chosen by lot between two candidates who had accompanied Jesus since John's baptism. About Matthias, almost nothing else is recorded. Some traditions place him in Ethiopia, others in the Caspian Sea region. He completes the number 12 and then disappears from known history. 12 men sent to a world that did not want them. They had no armies, they had no wealth, they had no political support. They had only one message: Jesus of Nazareth, crucified under Pontius Pilate, rose from the dead. God made him Lord and Christ. Repent, believe. This message was preached in Aramaic in the streets of Jerusalem. It was translated into Greek in the markets of Antioch and Ephesus. It echoed in Latin in the catacombs of Rome. It crossed deserts to Persia. It sailed to India. It reached, according to some traditions, as far as Spain and the British Isles. In 3 centuries, the empire that had crucified Jesus would bow before his cross. The cost was immense. Almost all the apostles died violently. Their families suffered persecution. Their communities faced imprisonment, torture, public executions. Nero lit his gardens with Christians in flames. Domitian demanded divine worship and executed those who refused. Trajan, Decius, Diocletian, emperor after emperor tried to eliminate the faith that those 12 fishermen and tax collectors had spread. They did not succeed. Jesus did not choose the qualified. He chose the available and qualified them along the way. Peter denied him 3 times and became the rock. Thomas doubted publicly and then traveled further than all the others to preach. Matthew was despised by his own nation and wrote the gospel most read by converted Jews. The pattern repeats, weakness transformed, not weakness hidden. Tradition says that John, the only one who did not die as a martyr, lived until he was 90. When he could no longer walk, his disciples carried him to the church meetings in Ephesus. And he always repeated the same phrase, "Little children, love one another." They asked why he only said that. He replied, "Because it is the Lord's commandment, and if only this is done, it is enough." 12 imperfect men. A message that crossed centuries. The same Jesus who called them continues to call. The question was never whether you are capable. The question is whether you are willing.